We are witnessing a moment that, by the rules of modern history, should be impossible: a sitting head of state, a sovereign president, not standing behind a podium in Caracas, not addressing his parliament, not surrounded by generals, flags, or symbols of authority, but inside a federal courtroom in the United States. No presidential sash, no formal attire, no diplomatic protocol. He was taken in his pajamas, wearing plastic flip-flops, dragged from his bed like a common criminal pulled from a midnight raid. This is not merely an arrest, it is a ritualized collapse of power. In a world that pretends to respect sovereignty, borders, and international law, this image detonates a taboo that has existed for centuries. Heads of state are not treated as domestic criminals by foreign powers. And yet, that taboo has just been shattered in public view. To understand how deliberate this act truly is, we must look beyond the courtroom and ask a more unsettling question. Where does this man sleep tonight? Not in a palace. Not in a protected residence. Not even in a secure diplomatic holding facility. He sleeps inside Metropolitan Detention Center, Brooklyn. On paper, MDC Brooklyn is a federal administrative prison. In reality, it is known by a far more accurate name, spoken quietly by guards, lawyers, and inmates alike: the Beast. This is not a prison designed to rehabilitate, it is a machine designed to break the human spirit. It is where the United States places people it considers too dangerous, too symbolic, or too politically explosive to house anywhere else, a concrete pressure chamber for power itself. El Chapo was held here. Ghislaine Maxwell was held here. U.S. senators have walked out of. Inspection tours visibly shaken. Reports describe food crawling with maggots. Cells left freezing and dark during polar vortexes, while guards clustered around portable heaters. A place where misery is not a byproduct, it is the point. And now, this is the new residence of a man who once controlled the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. That detail alone tells us everything we need to know. The United States is not merely detaining him. It is humiliating him, stripping away not just his freedom, but the very idea that he was ever untouchable. This is not about justice. This is about power made visible. Why do this? Why drag a president out of his bed in flip-flops? Why place him in one of the most brutal detention facilities in the United States? Why not negotiate exile, house arrest, or a quiet transfer behind closed doors? Because this was never just about removing a man from power. This was about making an example of him. There is an old military parable that explains this logic perfectly. A strict officer notices a soldier who has disobeyed orders by failing to shave his beard. The officer does not issue a fine. He does not give a warning. Instead, he pulls out a razor dry, with no soap, no water, and shaves the soldier's face in front of the entire unit. The blade tears skin. Blood runs. The pain is unforgettable. Then the officer turns to the rest of the platoon. Something remarkable happens. Every other soldier begins shaving immediately, carefully, with water and soap. They understand the lesson without a word being spoken. If they do not comply voluntarily and comfortably, compliance will be imposed painfully. The Venezuelan president is getting the dry shave. The United States is not speaking only to him, it is speaking to every leader watching from the sidelines. Presidents in Mexico, power brokers in Brazil, elites in Colombia and beyond. The message is brutally clear: comply with American interests on your own terms or we will come for you on ours. This is why the humiliation matters. Power is not only about control, it is about spectacle, about ensuring that resistance does not just fail, but fails publicly, in a way that terrifies observers into self-policing. This is not subtle diplomacy. This is psychological warfare at the level of heads of state, and that is what makes the next question so dangerous, because humiliating a president is one thing, reaching him at all is another. This man was not careless. He did not stroll the streets of Caracas. He lived inside a moving fortress rotating between bunkers, military bases, and underground facilities designed specifically to prevent this exact outcome. He was guarded by the Venezuelan military, protected by intelligence services trained for regime survival, and most critically, shielded by Cuban intelligence, an apparatus with a near-mythical reputation for paranoia and loyalty. So how does a foreign power extract a sitting president from the center of his own capital? There is only one answer: Someone opened the gates. This was not a flawless surgical operation, it was the visible result of a far darker process, the collapse of loyalty at the very top. A betrayal so deep it bypassed one of the most paranoid security systems in Latin America. What the public is being shown is a clean narrative, a lawful arrest, a justified operation, a dangerous criminal brought to justice. What is being hidden is far more unsettling. This operation requires inside knowledge, real-time location data, and a complete breakdown of trust within the inner circle. It suggests that the regime did not fall from the outside, it rotted from within, and that realization reframes everything, because this is no longer a story about drug trafficking or criminal justice. This is the opening shockwave of a geopolitical earthquake, one that points towards something much older, much larger, and far more aggressive than any single administration. The official justification is familiar, comforting, even drug trafficking, narco-terrorism, criminal indictments, law enforcement finally catching up with a rogue leader. It is a story designed to make the event feel normal, a matter of course and statutes rather than war and power, but that explanation collapses the moment you examine the scale of what actually happened. The United States did not simply arrest a man. It extracted a sitting head of state from his own capital, a city guarded by loyal military units and a security architecture built explicitly to prevent foreign intervention. No drug case justifies that. This was not a police action. It was a sovereign act of force. And to understand why the United States was willing to cross such a line, we have to stop thinking in terms of criminal law and start thinking in terms of imperial doctrine. What we are witnessing is the violent, unmistakable reactivation of a policy that has shaped the Western Hemisphere for over 2 centuries. The Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President James Monroe, guided by his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, issued a declaration that would define American power long before America was strong enough to enforce it. The premise was audacious. The Western Hemisphere was declared closed for business. Any attempts by European powers to colonize, control, or interfere in the affairs of North or South America would be considered an act of aggression against the United States itself. At the time, this was largely a bluff. The United States was young, militarily weak, and incapable of enforcing such a claim. Its navy could not stand against Britain, France, or Spain. Everyone in Europe knew this. That is precisely why the British made an offer. Britain, the true naval superpower of the era, proposed a joint declaration. London had the ships. Washington had the geography. Together, they could lock Europe out of Latin America's newly independent markets. It was a pragmatic, sensible deal. But John Quincy Adams saw further than his contemporaries. He warned President Monroe that America must not become, in his words, a cowboat in the wake of a British man of war. He understood that if the United States tied its authority to Britain, it would forever remain the junior partner. So America rejected the offer. Instead, it issued the doctrine unilaterally. This was not a policy for the present. It was a reservation for the future. A flag planted not in reality, but in time itself. The message was simple and chilling. This half of the planet belongs to us. We may not control it today, but we reserve the right to control it tomorrow. For 200 years, that doctrine pulsed beneath American foreign policy, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. It justified invasions, coups, blockades, and regime changes from Panama to Cuba to Chile. In recent decades, many believed it had faded into history, that globalization and multipolar power had made it obsolete. They were wrong. The seizure of the Venezuelan president is not an anomaly. It is the clearest signal yet that the Monroe Doctrine is back, and this time. It is not wearing the language of democracy or freedom, it is wearing the language of resources. For much of the post-Cold War era, American power was wrapped in ideology, democracy, human rights, rules-based order. These narratives were not always sincere. But they served a purpose. They made intervention appear moral, even inevitable. That era is ending. What has replaced it is far colder and far more honest. Resources, oil, gas, lithium, rare earth elements. In a world of fragmented supply chains and rising great power rivalry, these are no longer commodities. They are strategic weapons, and weapons, by definition, exist in a zero-sum environment. If one power controls them, another does not. This is the mindset that defines the current American strategy. And it is the lens through which the Venezuelan operation must be understood, not as an ideological clash, but as resource acquisition under geopolitical pressure. This logic explains decisions that once appeared absurd. Take Greenland. When Donald Trump first floated the idea of buying Greenland, the global reaction was ridicule. Commentators laughed. Diplomats rolled their eyes. It sounded like the fantasy of a real estate developer who didn't understand international politics. But the laughter missed the point. Trump did not just tweet about Greenland. His administration appointed a special envoy to the island, effectively a colonial governor in waiting. This was not a joke, it was preparation. Because Greenland is not just ice. Beneath its frozen surface lies one of the world's most valuable untapped reserves of rare earth minerals, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, the vitamins of modern industry. These materials are essential for F-35 fighter jets, electric vehicle motors, precision-guided weapons, and advanced electronics. And at the moment, China controls the market. Trump's Greenland gambit was an attempt to break that monopoly, to secure future supply chains before they could be weaponized against the United States. Now apply that same logic to Venezuela. This has nothing to do with elections, nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with human rights. It is about the Orinoco Belt, vast reserves of heavy crude oil that American Gulf Coast refineries are specifically designed to process, oil that cannot easily be replaced from elsewhere. From this perspective, the seizure of the Venezuelan president is the kinetic equivalent of the Greenland offer. One was a friendly bid, the other was a hostile takeover. Venezuela was a distressed asset sitting in the wrong geopolitical portfolio, aligned with China, protected by Russia, and sitting atop resources the United States considers critical. So the rules change. The message sent to Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil is unmistakable. Washington is no longer negotiating for cooperation, it is enforcing compliance, and that enforcement signals something even more dangerous. The rules governing sovereign nations are being rewritten in real time. What happened in Venezuela is not an exception, it is a template. What makes the Venezuelan operation so unsettling is not just its audacity, but its normalization. When questioned about the legality of removing a foreign head of state, the U.S. administration did not deny the action. Instead, it reframed it. They insisted this was not a coup. The system, they argued, remained intact. The vice president had assumed power. The bureaucracy continued to function. On paper, everything looked orderly. In reality, it was colonialism with modern branding. The acting president did not rise through a democratic awakening or a popular uprising. She emerged as the acceptable alternative, approved not by voters, but by the U.S. State Department, and the terms of this transition are revealing. There will be no elections for 18 months. Why 18 months? Because that is the minimum amount of time required to stabilize oil production, purge the military of unreliable loyalists, restructure the energy sector, and ensure that when elections do happen, the outcome aligns with Washington's strategic needs. This is not speculation, it is mechanics. During this period, the new government does not operate as an independent sovereign authority. It operates as an administrative extension of American power. Orders flow not from Caracas outward, but from Washington downward. When asked who is effectively running Venezuela, the answer given privately was blunt: we are. The economic structure makes this even clearer. The United States has been explicit about its intentions. There is no rhetoric of liberation or freedom. Instead, there is a simple transactional statement: we will buy the oil, we will hold the money. Revenue from Venezuelan oil exports will not flow into the national treasury, it will be placed in escrow accounts controlled by the U.S. Treasury. Officially, this is to prevent corruption and criminal misuse. In practice, it means the wealth of the country is being seized to fund its own occupation. This is not a new idea. It is a modernized version of the Iraq Oil for Food program. Stripped of its humanitarian veneer, compliance is enforced economically first, militarily second. And what happens if the new leadership resists? That question was asked directly. The answer was chillingly simple: we will hit them again. Force is no longer a last resort, it is the opening move. This is the Monroe Doctrine in its rawest, most honest form. No euphemisms, no moral camouflage, just power, applied openly. to secure resources. But this still leaves one crucial question unanswered. How did the United States reach the man at the center of it all? To understand the scale of what happened, we have to appreciate what was supposed to be impossible. The Venezuelan president did not live in one palace. He lived inside a moving security bubble rotating between hardened military bases, underground bunkers, and classified safe houses. His location changed constantly, routes were randomized, communications were compartmentalized. This system was not amateur, it was designed and supervised by Cuban intelligence, widely regarded as one of the most effective regime protection services in the world. The same apparatus that kept Fidel Castro alive through more than 600 documented assassination attempts, exploding cigars, poison wetsuits, sniper plots, biological agents. Castro died in his own bed. That reputation for near invincibility is precisely why the Venezuelan leadership trusted the Cubans with their lives. The assumption was simple: Cuban handlers were incorruptible. That assumption was wrong, according to details emerging from Pentagon and intelligence sources. The United States did not stumble upon the president's location. This was the culmination of a long-term, high-stakes intelligence operation. We are talking about the deployment of roughly 200 elite operative CIA paramilitary officers, FBI specialists, and supporting assets embedded inside Caracas for months, 200 foreign operatives operating inside a capital city supposedly on high alert. That level of penetration does not happen by accident. It implies that Venezuelan counterintelligence was not merely outmatched, it was neutralized. Eyes were blinded, ears were silenced, or, more likely, they were bought. The most explosive allegation concerns betrayal at the highest level of the security perimeter. A Cuban handler responsible for the inner ring of protection allegedly provided precise geolocation data that led the American strike team directly to the bunker where the president was sleeping. If true, this represents a collapse of trust that will echo through every authoritarian security apparatus on Earth. But the operation went even further. This was not improvisation, it was rehearsal. In a classified location inside the United States, possibly the Nevada desert or the swamps of Florida, the military constructed a full-scale replica of the Venezuelan president's safe house. For 60 days, Tier 1 operators from Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 ran the scenario repeatedly. They practiced the breach, they practiced the extraction, they mapped every guard rotation, to every corridor, every contingency. Nothing was left to chance. Satellite imagery alone could not have made this possible. Russian-made S-300 and S-400 air defense systems protected Venezuelan airspace. A conventional airstrike would have triggered alarms immediately, so the raid did not come from the sky. It came on the ground, silent, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. To capture a moving target required the highest form of intelligence, human intelligence. Someone in the room, someone close enough to say, "He is here tonight." That level of precision sends a message far beyond Venezuela. It tells every adversary that their air defenses, their bunkers, their security rituals may no longer matter. But even this does not explain the most disturbing dimension of the operation, because there is reason to believe that this president was not just betrayed locally, he may have been traded globally. The most unsettling possibility is not that the Venezuelan president was outmaneuvered, it is that he was sold. This theory gained traction after testimony from Fiona Hill, the former National Security Council official specializing in Russian and European affairs. During her appearance before Congress, she made a remark that passed largely unnoticed by mainstream media, but immediately set off alarms among intelligence analysts. She revealed that, in previous diplomatic back channels, Venezuela had been placed on the negotiating table. The implication was staggering. Russia, facing mounting pressure in Eastern Europe, may have quietly offered to reduce or withdraw its protective umbrella over Venezuela in exchange for strategic concessions elsewhere, specifically a freer hand in Ukraine. In that calculus, Venezuela is not a core interest, Ukraine is for Moscow. Securing influence over its near abroad is existential. Maintaining a foothold in the Caribbean is a luxury. Empires do not sacrifice queens for pawns. They sacrifice pawns to protect queens. This reframes the entire operation. Those Russian-made S-400 air defense systems may not have failed. They may have been ordered not to fire. In the ruthless arithmetic of great power politics, Venezuela becomes a bargaining chip discarded to secure a larger strategic objective. The Venezuelan president believed Russian backing guaranteed his survival. He believed he was protected by the logic of multipolar competition. He miscalculated, and while Russia may have walked away with something valuable, there is another player who paid a far higher price: China. For Beijing, the fall of the Venezuelan government is not an embarrassment, it is a strategic disaster. China was not a distant partner, it was the primary patron of Venezuela's energy sector. At various points, nearly 90% of Venezuelan oil exports flowed eastward not as ordinary trade, but as repayment for massive Chinese infrastructure loans, highways, ports, power plants, telecommunications. Billions of dollars were invested on the assumption that the regime would survive long enough to pay China back in crude. That assumption is now dead. With American control over the transition, those contracts are effectively meaningless. Oil that once flowed to Shanghai will now flow to Houston. Tankers will turn north, not west. This is not an isolated incident. It fits into a much larger pattern of systematic encirclement. Look at the global choke points that matter to China. Instability in the Red Sea has disrupted shipping through the Suez Canal, forcing Chinese exports onto longer, more expensive routes around Africa. In the Western Hemisphere, U.S. influence over the Panama Canal remains an unspoken but decisive lever over global logistics. Add to that the potential disruption of Iranian oil supplies, another critical energy partner for Beijing, and now the loss of Venezuelan crude. The picture becomes unmistakable. The United States is not competing with China symmetrically, it is not trying to outproduce or out-innovate it in every sector, it is severing arteries. Energy security is the foundation of industrial power. Without reliable oil and gas, factories slow, logistics strain, growth falters. The Venezuelan operation strikes directly at that foundation. Beijing issued formal statements condemning the move and vowing to protect its interests. But statements are cheap. On the ground in Caracas, reality looks very different. Chinese diplomats are watching as American executives from Chevron and ExxonMobil step off planes and into boardrooms. Deals are being rewritten in real time. The Monroe Doctrine has reemerged as a wall, and China has just slammed into it at full speed. This is not only about money, it is about face, about prestige, about the collapse of strategic depth in the Western Hemisphere. The Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America has been effectively severed, but while empires negotiate and corporations move in, another drama is unfolding inside Venezuela itself. In Caracas, the transition is being staged with meticulous care. Cameras capture solemn ceremonies, officials speak of continuity. The vice president is sworn in under the pretense of constitutional order. On the surface, it looks calm, orderly, almost legitimate. In reality, it is political theater of the highest order. The spectacle is designed to send a message. Nothing has changed, the party remains, the institutions endure, the nation moves forward, but one image shatters that illusion. The son of the captured president stands before the cameras, praising his father's legacy while simultaneously validating the authority of the very government installed by the power that seized him. It is an act of public loyalty performed under private coercion. This contradiction speaks volumes about the pressure being applied behind closed doors. It is not persuasion, it is leverage, and a most decisive leverage was applied not to politicians, but to generals. The Venezuelan military high command did not fight, tanks did not roll air, defenses did not engage, barracks remained quiet. This silence is not neutrality, it is a deal. The generals who controlled the arteries of power, the drug routes, the oil flows, the patronage networks made a calculation. Resistance would mean annihilation, cooperation meant survival, so they traded their commander-in-chief for immunity. Their ranks remain intact, their pensions are preserved, their wealth is untouched. They stay in their barracks, while the man they once saluted spends his nights in a freezing cell in Brooklyn. This is how regimes truly fall, not with explosions, but with transactions. But the story does not end in Caracas. It moves to New York, where the final battleground is not military or economic, but legal. Because the man in that cell is refusing to accept the role assigned to him. In New York, the case is being framed with surgical precision. The U.S. Department of Justice insists this is simple, a criminal indictment, a narco-terrorist brought to justice, no different, legally speaking, from El Chapo, by labeling the Venezuelan head of state a drug trafficker. The United States strips him of the single protection that matters most, sovereign immunity. If he is a criminal, he falls under U.S. domestic law. If he is a criminal, he can be tried, convicted, and buried inside the American prison system. If he is a criminal, this was law enforcement, not war. That framing is not accidental. But, inside the courtroom, a very different argument is emerging. The deposed president is refusing to accept the label. He has shouted to reporters. His lawyers have filed motions that challenge the foundation of the case itself. Their claim is explosive. He is not a criminal. He is a prisoner of war. This distinction changes everything. If he is a drug dealer, the United States controls the process. But, if he is a prisoner of war capture, during a military operation conducted by a hostile foreign power, then the conflict is no longer criminal. It is international armed conflict. Under the Geneva Conventions of 1949, prisoners of war are entitled to specific protections. They must be treated humanely, shielded from intimidation and public spectacle, given adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Most importantly, they cannot be tried for lawful acts of war, and when hostilities end, they must be repatriated by claiming POW status. The former president is attempting a desperate legal maneuver, but a profoundly political one. He is forcing U.S. courts to confront an uncomfortable question. If this was not a war, why did it require special forces, intelligence penetration, and a cross-border extraction of a head of state? The American position rests on a contradiction. It claims the United States is not at war with Venezuela while simultaneously executing a military raid to seize its leader. The POW argument threatens to expose that contradiction in open court, and even if the claim ultimately fails, it achieves something crucial. It reframes the story, no longer as a criminal brought to justice, but as a sovereign leader captured by force in an undeclared conflict. That reframing does not just affect one man in a Brooklyn cell. It destabilizes the rules that govern the entire international system. For centuries, sovereignty was simple. If you controlled territory, commanded an army, and were recognized by other states, you were untouchable. You could be sanctioned, isolated, even overthrown indirectly, but you could not be arrested. That rule was sacred not because leaders were innocent, but because the alternative was chaos. If great powers could simply seize foreign heads of state, then diplomacy collapses into hostage-taking. What happened in Venezuela signals that this rule no longer applies. The United States did not invade, it did not declare war, it did not occupy territory. Instead, it performed a precision decapitation of sovereignty, one man removed, one legal narrative imposed, one regime forced to reorganize itself around survival. This is not old-style imperialism, it is something far more efficient. Call it lawfare imperialism. Military force opens the door. Legal classification finishes the job. Once a leader is redefined as a criminal enterprise, sovereignty dissolves, borders stop protecting, titles lose meaning, international law becomes a weapon rather than a shield. And here is the critical part. This tactic only works against certain countries, not nuclear powers, not treaty anchors, not states whose collapse would trigger global retaliation. It works against isolated regimes, dependent economies, and leaders whose inner circles are already compromised by corruption. In other words, it works where loyalty is transactional. Venezuela was the test case, but it will not be the last. Every sanctioned state is now watching closely. Every embattled strongman is recalculating their exit strategy. Every general is asking the same question. If the moment comes, will Washington call me a partner or a target? Because once sovereignty becomes conditional, survival no longer depends on legitimacy or popular support. It depends on utility. Useful leaders are tolerated. Useless ones are criminalized. This is the quiet rule of the 21st century international order. And it leaves one final question hanging in the air. If the United States can do this, who decides? When it stops, what happened to Venezuela's leadership is not an isolated episode. It is a proof of concept. For decades, power was measured in aircraft carriers, missile counts, and alliance blocks. Those tools still matter, but they are no longer decisive on their own. The real shift is this. Power is now the ability to decide who is a state actor and who is a criminal organization. Once that line is crossed, everything changes. Sanctions stop being pressure tools and become preparation. Indictments stop being symbolic and become strategic weapons. Courts stop being neutral arenas and become extensions of foreign policy. This creates a world where regime change no longer requires invasion, it requires financial surveillance, legal jurisdiction, intelligence penetration, and one moment of physical access that is cheaper than war, cleaner than occupation, and far harder to resist. And it is not just the United States learning this lesson. China is watching carefully. Russia is taking notes. Regional powers are adapting. Everyone now understands that tanks are loud but handcuffs are permanent. This is why future leaders will behave differently. They will prioritize personal legal insulation over national development. They will hoard assets in jurisdictions beyond reach. They will empower security services not to defend borders, but to protect individuals. The result is a darker, more paranoid global system, one where diplomacy erodes, trust collapses, and every summit carries an unspoken fear. Who has the files? Who controls the courts? Who can make the call? Venezuela's collapse was not just the fall of a regime. It was the unveiling of a new hierarchy. At the top sit those who can define legality itself. Below them are states that exist only as long as they remain useful. And at the bottom are leaders who discover too late that sovereignty is no longer a shield. It is a license, and licenses can be revoked.